Okay, I keep seeing some of the participant numbers go up, but I'm going to go ahead and just get started with a quick introduction. My name is Morgan Sprecher. I am the MIPA president. And for you, those of you who are not associated with MIPA, we are the Midwest Injury Prevention Alliance, which is an organization for injury professionals from those Midwest states here in Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And we work collaboratively to reduce unintentional and intentional injury-related deaths and disabilities. So I'm going to go ahead and kick this webinar off by introducing our first speaker. We're so excited to have him. It is Dale O. Ritzel, the former professor of public health at the Southern Illinois University of Carbondale. Dr. Ritzel has held numerous leadership positions within the American Driver and Traffic Safety Education Association, including several terms as its research division chair, vice chair, and secretary. He has also served as president of the American Academy of Safety Education, an organization in which he holds fellow status. Over the course of his career, Ritzel has published 160 articles, received research grants totaling more than $20 million, and overseen the graduate work of close to 100 students. In 2005, Ritzel's paper, Designing and Developing Web-Based Courses for Safety and Health Programs, received the second Best Paper Award from the American Society of Safety Engineers, Best of the Best Papers in the Practice Specialties. So help me in welcoming Dale Ritzel, and it is all you. Go ahead, take it away.
Well, thank you very much. It's a honor to be here and to talk to. I see 35 plus people at this point, and so I appreciate the introduction. My mother would be very happy to hear that, even though she's now been deceased for about 10 years. So if we can go to the next slide, please, we will get a start on this. I've been asked to talk to this group about marijuana and teenage driving risk in the Midwest. I originally did this presentation to the injury prevention folks for the Illinois Department of Public Health in Illinois, and I was asked to do this one. I expanded it a little bit just to make sure that we talk a little bit about the other 6 states in the Midwest that's a part of this organization, the Midwest Injury Prevention Alliance. Next slide, please. This is what I intend to talk about and to get into some little bit of details on. I'm not going to spend much time, even though I got some detailed information about the marijuana laws in these 6 states. A lot of my focus, because of what I've been doing, will talk about some of the marijuana used by teenagers in Illinois and some other places, but I also want to talk about motor vehicle crash rates, how marijuana affects the body and in the teenager's brain, and particularly how it affects the teenager's brain, and some of the things that are some likely risks of teenage driving and marijuana use. Next slide, please. I want to start out, and I should probably end this way too, saying that marijuana is still illegal at the federal level and remains classified as a Schedule I drug under the Federal Controlled Substance Act. And that's the thing we all have to realize, even though, as we see in the second paragraph I have in this slide, that as of March 1st of this year, medical marijuana use is now legal in 36 states, and recreational cannabis use is legal in 15 states around the United States. And so even though we do have against the federal law, we are making it possible in these states for both medical and recreational marijuana. I will give you an example. Like in Southern Illinois, my medical doctor, my family doctor, is also an addiction specialist, and because of the fact that he works for a community health center, it's not possible for him to give any prescriptions to anybody in regards to medical marijuana, or it would affect our status or his status in regards to the community health center, because we are funded by federal money in part. Next slide, please. This is a map showing some of the status of different marijuana legalization in the country. The black states, they're totally legalized, and I will add that when I copy this map, for whatever reason, the state of Oregon became blue. The state of Oregon is black in regards to this designation. Ever since I did this, there's one other state that's been added to the to this category of now fully legalized, and that's the state of New Jersey. New Jersey is not reflected on this map as black. I could not find a map in the last few weeks that showed actually New Jersey in the black, but we can see that there are also states that are fully illegal, the gray colored states, and so there's about 10 of those, about 8 of those states that are, including one of the states that's involved in this alliance, Midwest Alliance. So we're changing rapidly. This has been a rapid thing that's happened in probably the last 10 years or less, and I think we will continue to see things change a lot, because a lot of it has to do with helping to become a way to raise money in the various different states too. Next slide, please. Let me talk a little bit about some of the different states' laws, and since the first state alphabetically in these states is Illinois, I'll talk about Illinois first. In 2013, we had a law that was called the Compassionate Use of Marijuana Cannabis Pilot Program Act. It's probably got an acronym that says something, but it really made it possible for medical people to prescribe medical marijuana to individuals. A year later, the state of Illinois added the condition of seizures to this. Right now we have 49 qualifying medical conditions in which doctors can, with their patients, prescribe care in regards to marijuana. In Illinois, you need to have a written certification in order to go to a medical marijuana facility and show that you are legally able to get marijuana in that way. Next slide, please. A few years later, a couple years later, we introduced the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, which was a way to raise taxes too, but it made recreational use marijuana possible, and where people can go to licensed dispensaries across the state and get marijuana legally without having a medical prescription. There are limits both for Illinois residents, and on the next slide I'll go to in a couple of minutes, for non-residents. 30 grams of cannabis flower, 5 grams of cannabis concentrate. You can have no more than 500 milligrams in a cannabis infused product. And also people who are registered as medical cannabis program can also grow their own cannabis at their residence under certain conditions. Look at those numbers again, 35 and 500 in regards to the first 3 bullet points on this slide. Let's go to the next slide. You'll notice that the possession limits for non-Illinois residents are half the amount they were for Illinois residents, and so people can come in Illinois, but they have to show ID, and if they show they're out of state, then their limits are half the amount that people in Illinois can get. If you've been near any of the recreational cannabis dispensaries in Illinois, as well as medical dispensaries, there's usually a long line of people outside waiting to get in. In some spots, because of COVID-19, there's even a drive-through or drive-up where curbside pickup in regards particularly to the medical marijuana. So things have changed quite a bit in the last few years in Illinois as well as other states. Next slide, please. Driving under the influence of Illinois in regards to cannabis is totally illegal and prohibited. Those caught behind the wheel under the influence face very deep and steep charges, very similar as, or the same really as alcohol DUI. It's illegal, also in Illinois, it's illegal to operate any aircraft, motorboat, or any other motor vehicle under the influence of cannabis. Also, it's illegal to transport marijuana in your car unless it's in a secure, sealed, tempered container, tampered evident container that's inaccessible while the vehicle is moving. When people ask me what this means, is that in the trunk is okay, but you really can't have it within the compartment of your vehicle unless it's in a locked container. So that's one thing people have to think about, and that's really true in most of the other states too, where they have recreational marijuana. Next slide, please, our medical too. Indiana law, it's basically against the law for people to have any form of cannabis except for CBD, which is a derivative of the marijuana plant, but that's only got a can only contain 0.3% level of THC. It's also a misdemeanor in Indiana to have up to 30 grams, and also you can be put in jail for 180 days and fined too, various amounts. And then 30 grams is a felony, which has a lot more severe type of punishment. Indiana in May of 2017 allowed, as I indicated above, medical CBD, but it's only for certain types of conditions, and the amount that's available or present or can be used is relatively low, so people won't be able to have too much of it. Next slide. The Indiana marijuana and driving laws are really like almost all the rest of them. It's zero tolerance, and you can't have anything in regards to even CBD, and it's punishable by 60 days in jail upon conviction for the first offense in Indiana. Next slide, please. Let's go to Minnesota. Actually, that's where my daughter lives, a great state. Marijuana is illegal recreational-wise in Minnesota, but it is allowed specifically for a variety of medical conditions. Their medical marijuana law was signed into law in 2014 and reduces or removes a criminal penalty, excuse me. And you can see some of the qualifying conditions for people, including glaucoma and some of the other types of things that aren't probably as severe a condition as we may have in some other states. But as the case in places where they've, in other states, not necessarily just the Midwest, where they've permitted a limit of possession of marijuana, only a 30-day supply, and in the case of even recreational in Illinois, they're talking about non-smokable forms of marijuana are permitted. Next slide. In Minnesota, the person is guilty of misdemeanor if they are the owner of a private motor vehicle or the driver of a motor vehicle. If the owner is not present, possess on person any more than 1.4 grams of marijuana. 1.4 grams of marijuana really isn't too much. And the area does not include the trunk, which is the case in many other states, but a utility or glove compartment is deemed to be within the area occupied by the driver or passengers. And even the passengers in most states too, including Minnesota, cannot be smoking marijuana when they're in the car, even though the driver may not be. Next slide, please. Michigan, we know that both recreational and medical marijuana is legal in Michigan. Possession limits are relatively high. Home cultivation is permitted, and it's available through licensed dispensaries throughout the state, both for recreational and medical. Their recreational marijuana law became active or legalized in November of 2018. Allows and permits people 21 years or older to buy up to 1.5 ounces of marijuana and keep up to 10 ounces at home. Uh, and so it's a law that continues to work pretty well, and it creates a licensing system for the state in regards to businesses, including growers, processors, transporters, and so on, like what they've done in Illinois and some other states too. They've actually put a good control on that, which is, as I indicated earlier, has actually been a good taxing program for the state. And in Illinois, they have estimated that the first year the state will take in $1 billion of new taxable income because of the recreational and particularly the recreational, but also the medical marijuana system too. Next slide, please. In Michigan, we indicated that the law has been around for a while, 2008, and it includes a variety of different types of diseases for the medical marijuana, and you can see they're very similar to some of the other ones, but some of these are probably a little bit more more severe types of conditions, like one that we don't necessarily see. It is in the Illinois law, PTSD, and some of the other types of muscle spasms and seizures and so on. Next slide, please. In Michigan, it's actually, now that marijuana is legal recreational-wise, but the drivers must obey certain laws in regards to actually operating a vehicle. They cannot operate a vehicle under the influence of marijuana, period. They cannot consume marijuana while driving. People that are passengers inside the car cannot smoke marijuana. And there's many reasons why, particularly because of the smoke that would be in the vehicle while it's on any type of public road. Next slide, please. Now we're coming to Ohio, which became the 25th state to legalize medical marijuana in 2016. And again, like most other states' laws, that they allow cannabis plant material, edibles, patches, oils, and tinctures, and but they do prohibit different types of smokable marijuana products and home cultivations. And you can see again here, this list is very much like the one that we saw in a couple of the other states that are for medical treatment of using marijuana. And so I will let you read those, and we can move to the next slide, please. Also, as far as marijuana in Ohio, that they're looking at marijuana the same as they do alcohol, and even though they specify the amount of THC in your body in regards to milliliter of blood, and you can see how they're broken down in regards to that. And it's good that this is happening in some of the states, because it gives law enforcement and medical personnel who's doing blood samples to really see what's going on, even though they are working on a breathalyzer type of device for marijuana. I think it will be a few more years until we see one in more common use in the United States. So this is the start of something that will allow us to actually measure once those devices are on the market. Next slide, please. And then finally, Wisconsin. Wisconsin is the simplest one to talk about because they do not prohibit any type of marijuana use other than permitting the use of medical CBD oil. And this has to be recommended, suggested by a physician, but we have seen in Wisconsin certain localities have decriminalized simple possession and replacing criminal penalties with no more than a fine. So next slide, please. And if we do find people under the influence of marijuana, they've got zero tolerance against driving under the influence, and which means that any detectable amount of delta-9 THC, the active ingredient, can result in severe penalties. And they've got a different, they don't have a DUI, they have an operating while intoxicated, which is really the same thing, but it pertains to also marijuana in the state of Wisconsin. So they've got a very strict penalty to driving under the influence of marijuana too. Next slide, please. Let's take a brief look, since we've talked about and looked at some of the laws that we have on the books in regards to the 6 different states. So let's see what we are finding around the United States as of now. And I think one of the things that, if I would be giving this talk a year from now, we would be seeing a lot more research finally coming out, because of the fact that this is so new, this whole area, and what effect it really has. That I think we'll find that things won't probably change much in regards to some of the things I'm going to present to you, but at least we'll have more data. But we know when anybody gets high from marijuana and gets behind the wheel of a car, they're taking on a great risk in regards to driving, in regards to some of the things I'll talk about a little bit later. But we have found that as marijuana legalization has increased, the rate of marijuana impaired traffic crashes have also increased. What makes even the matter worse is that the number of traffic-related deaths have also gone up. In 2018, about 12 million Americans, or 4.7% of the population that's over the age of 16, drove under the influence of marijuana. This is self-reporting. About 2.3 million, or roughly 0.9% of the same age group, drove a vehicle under the influence of illicit drugs or other than marijuana in 2018. So we can see that 12 million folks, I don't know if that has a meaning to you, that has a big meaning to me, because that's a lot of people. Next slide. If we can see what's happened in regards to marijuana and what we've seen through a more recent report from CDC, percentage of people age 16 and over who've reported driving a vehicle under the influence, when I see that about 9% of young people between the ages of 16 and 20 have reported that in the last year they've smoked marijuana and been under the influence of marijuana while driving. But when we add to that the 21 to 25 category, which is probably about 12.5%, that adds a lot more to that. One of the things I'm going to get into in the time being, we find that a person's brain does not fully develop until they're 25 years to 30 years of age. And so when we have a significant population of people who are driving under the influence of marijuana, where even if their brains aren't developed, that is a big issue and will continue to be a big issue. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at some of the first couple states that got marijuana laws, particularly recreational marijuana laws. One of them being Colorado and the other one being the state of Washington. Let's take a look at Colorado first. We saw that marijuana-related traffic deaths increased 66% in the 4-year average since Colorado increased recreational marijuana. We're talking about in the end of 2012 is when they got this new law in Colorado, and so it increased by 66%. Now at the same time, all traffic deaths increased by 16%. Marijuana-related traffic deaths increased 66%. All traffic crashes increased 16%. In 2009, all fatalities involved persons who had tested positive for marijuana. By 16, that number had risen to 21%. So we're seeing over a 2 times increase, and you'll find in Washington is very similar with the data. In Colorado, in the study in 2018, 69% of the pot users said they had driven under the influence of marijuana at least once in the last year, and 27%, more than 1 out of 4, drove high almost daily. And we know from quantitative types of studies that marijuana, particularly recreational users, say they don't think it affects their ability to drive. But we know once we get into the brain of the individuals that it does. Next slide, please. Okay, let's look at Colorado. The AAA Foundation did a study a few years ago. They actually followed up with another study, and they wanted to take a look at what effect that the marijuana law had, recreational marijuana law had in regards to increasing fatal crashes and crashes in general within the state of Washington. Next slide, please. Data on all drivers in the state of Washington from 2008 to 2017 were obtained from the Traffic Safety Commission of the state of Washington, and they looked at it from various types of composite parts, and a 5-year period before, and you remember what it was for Colorado, the 5-year period of time for legal, an estimated 8.8% of the drivers involved in fatal crashes were positive for THC. After the law was passed, it rose to 18%. Again, a little bit over 2 times increase from the pre-time where before the law was passed until after the law was passed. Next slide, please. The average number of fatalities, or the number of drivers that were in fatal crashes before the law became passed was 56. After the law was passed, it jumped to 130. These were drivers that were tested positive for THC. And they didn't really determine whether it contributed to the crashes in the latest one, but the next slide I think is an important one for us to consider. If we go to the next slide, please. Again, this shows you graphically that on average it was about 8.8% of drivers had been tested to 18.8% afterwards. You can see that we've got kind of a line going up a little bit each year, and so I'm not sure that I'm not sure whether this will continue. We'll have to see as we take a look at data for the 3 or 4 years that followed after that. So I think this is a very straightforward picture of what's happening. Next slide, please. In a summary, it's a well-expected summary. It suggests that legalization of recreational use of marijuana may increase, and I've used the word may because we can't do anything more than say that it may increase. We can see that it is increasing, but we'll have to take a look at this data over a period of time and see whether this continues to be the case. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that surprises people about marijuana, and I will be very clear on this. I've never smoked a cigarette in my life, and I've never smoked marijuana. So I'm talking as a person that has no direct knowledge of actually smoking marijuana. But we know from all the analysis that we've done over the years that in the 1970s, the THC in marijuana was generally, I'm talking about the plant, was generally about 2% THC. Right now we're seeing that the THC in our new, well-developed hybrid type of marijuana plants are now 20 to 25, and some of the recent stuff I'm reading that the THC is in some cases up to 30% in the plants. And so what we're doing, we're finding that people, the marijuana is not the same as maybe your parents or grandparents smoked, back many years ago. It's a lot more potent, and so it doesn't take as much of a issue to have people become, let's say, affected or overwhelmed with smoking marijuana. We've also found too with the concentrated part of products like oils and shatter and dab and edibles that the concentration of THC can go up to 95%. And so it's not the fact that you're probably in taking in less THC with the edibles and those types of things. You're probably taking in the more, but it takes longer to get into your body system versus smoking marijuana. And I want you to think, what does this mean to you as you talk to people about smoking or dealing with marijuana from some years earlier to today? When we start talking with young people, it has a lot more of an effect on you. As we talk to adults, it has a lot more of an effect on you. So that's the type of thing I'd like to have you think about as we move on in this presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, let's take a look at marijuana's effects on the body. And the cannabinoids actually affect two receptors in the brain, CB1 and CB2. CB1 is linked to the nervous system. CB2 is connected to the immune system. In my case, if I would take marijuana, I've got a fairly significant autoimmune disease, so I would be bothered with that part. But for the most part, it's the CB1 that affects people in regards to the CB1 factors, which means the chemical affects the brain. In the brain, the THC mimics something known as bliss molecule or anonymine, a chemical that naturally occurs in the body. This chemical, as well as others, affect the brain areas that play a role in memory, pleasure, cognition, concentration, movement, coordination, sensory perception, and perception of time. Now, when you think about those terms, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about marijuana and driving. Think about which of those terms may cause people to have issues with driving, particularly young people. Next slide, please. One of the most important areas that is affected by THC is the hippocampus, which plays a critical role in learning and memory. If you take THC, it limits the brain's capacity to learn new things and do complex tasks. I'm going to get into the brain a little bit in a few minutes, but one of the things to think about is that if it limits the brain's capacity to learn new things and do complex tasks, we know that it will affect the teenager's brain. At the same time, it stimulates your reward system to release more of this neurotransmitter called dopamine, which adds up to the feeling of being high. But we know that dopamine neurotransmitters can actually be an issue with young people too if they start smoking pot at too young of an age. Next slide, please. Okay, let's take a look at marijuana. Let's imagine that we're sitting there smoking a joint right now, and we know that this joint, once it's smoked, the various types of chemicals, including THC, passes from the lungs into the bloodstream, which rapidly carries them throughout the body and to the brain. And a person almost begins immediately to have the effect of feeling pleasant euphoria and a sense of relaxation. And we also see that it can also affect in different ways different people, a heightened sensory perception. Everything's brighter if you're actually driving a car. under the influence of marijuana. Imagine an oncoming car at night coming at you. Laughter, altered states of perception of time, and increased appetite. Next slide, please. What does marijuana do to your body and brain? It affects the way it changes your ability to process information. Think about driving down the road and there's somebody pulls out in front of you. How long does it take you under the influence of marijuana to respond and process information versus not being under the influence? It causes your eyes to turn red. It may dilate your eyes a bit. It causes you to have a balance problem. And balance is one of the things that we use when we're driving. And this is even more particularly true when you're on a motorcycle or a bicycle or even walking. And so if it causes you to have a balance problem, then you know what can happen. It also affects our brain access areas to process what we hear and what we see, and it can cause you to hallucinate. So you may be seeing things that may not in reality be going on. It increases our heart rate, we know, and so that's not good from the standpoint of you reacting to things. Next slide, please. And some of these things I've mentioned, I find it's important. I mention them over and over again. It inhibits concentration, slow reaction times, cloud judgments. It affects the way that we have found in different studies. It impairs ability to drive. Research suggests that users who drive high are up to twice as high to be involved in a crash. Two large European studies that are coming out, and the Europeans are doing a little bit more work on this too, found that drivers with THC in their blood were roughly twice as likely to be culpable for a fatal crash than drivers who had not used drugs or alcohol. So it's not just twice as much, but it's twice as much for people who use other drugs and alcohol. That's not correctly what I should have said there, but it's more than people who've not used alcohol or drugs. Next slide, please. One of the things we found, though, is that with marijuana, it can stay in your body for weeks or even a month. And normally people, when they smoke pot, usually many times combine it with alcohol. And when you combine those two, it's kind of hard to see what the influence is of marijuana versus alcohol. But we know that when people have THC in their body, they're 3 to 4 times likely to be responsible for an incident in drivers who had not used it. But we know that the combination with other drugs, what we're seeing at this point, is that it will probably have a greater effect, the combination, than either drug by itself. Next slide, please. I think it's important, and I think one of the things I find that I think it's important we know how young people, and I'm talking about people probably ages from 14 to 17 or 18, are using marijuana, and we've got a Center for Prevention Research and Development, the School of Social Work at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, that they each year since 2008 have done the Illinois Youth Survey. The most recent data that they have available is from 2018. They collected data during 2020, but as of this morning, it still wasn't available. So I'm going to report on the data for 2018. Next slide, please. We have found in Illinois that the marijuana use for any grade level, and we're talking about all grades, not just high school, has not changed or has remained stable since 2018, 2008, excuse me. But I'm interested to see how this will change as we now have recreational laws, even though it's illegal. for people under the age of 21 to actually be able to get and use marijuana. But it's main stable from the first year it was done until 10 or so years later. Next slide, please. And if you take a look at 8th grade versus 10th grade versus 12th grade, that the progression as they go almost year to year, but I'm just breaking this down by 8th, 10th, and 12th, goes up from 8th grade to 5%, or 1 in 20 reported use, to 10th grade about 13%, to 12th grade over 25%. So it means by the time that young people, and again, this is in Illinois, and I would imagine this data probably somewhat similar to other states, that, and this is marijuana use in the last 30 days. It means by the time the student gets into their senior year or through their senior year, they're about 1 out of 4 is smoking marijuana. Next slide, please. But we find no real differences between marijuana use patterns and between males and females. So this is an equal opportunity use drug. Both males and females use them equally in regards to that. African American teens reported higher 30-day marijuana use than any other racial category. And marijuana use patterns are different among areas of the state, with reported use higher within the city of Chicago. We tend to find that reported marijuana use in many states that have had recreational marijuana is also true more for the bigger cities or towns within the state. Next slide, please. We also find that we've looked at this University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana studies looked at where do they get their marijuana. And I think this is one of the things we need to be addressing in regards to any kind of programming that any individual or groups are wanting to look at. That friends are the most common source. That's the blue line there. And that's true. It even goes up a little bit higher when you go from 8th grade, 10th grade to 12th grade. The second most common use is buying it from one who sells marijuana. You'll notice that this goes up a little bit each year in regards to that. The other sources which are listed here are a sibling gave it to the individual, and then the other last one is taking it for parents. Now, as they get older, they tend to take it less from their parents, and because they've got their own sources of friends or own sources of people that will sell it to them. And and this pattern has not really changed much either in the last 10, 12 years. Next slide, please. You know, going back to my earlier days and looking at teenage brains particularly, because I've always felt it was a big relation to how we teach young people how to drive, for example. And we thought for a long time, due to the science that we had, that a human brain was fully developed by age 10. And now, as I mentioned a while ago, that the brain is actually not fully developed. It goes through a growth spurt and then goes through a spurt of losing stuff and having to start over again to being fully developed by maybe age 25 to 30. And so we know that this is something that happens and will continue to happen because of the research that's been done recently. Next slide, please. As the gray matter grows and peaks just right before puberty, it starts to prune back as the child goes through adolescence. So which means that, you know, a kid, let's say, is really doing a lot of developing when they're 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever age up, you know, through puberty starts. And once that happens, then the brain starts to prune back in the development, and so the teenager is like having to grow their brain all over again. And if you worked with teenagers, you may already know this, Uh, but one of the things that it does, it really affects their frontal lobes, which is the seat of judgment and decision making, and so it makes us have to work harder to teach young people, particularly teenagers, how to do things because of the fact they're having to learn stuff for a second time when you really take a look at brain development. Next slide, please. And as the teenage brain comes into the whole thing, the brain becomes sluggish, and the nerves need fatty coating called myelin or white matter, and they don't have as much as adults do, and so it results in parts of the brain not communicating with other parts of the brain, uh, and so it's a type of thing that that in teenagers that we need to do things, particularly in regards to judgment, decision making, because the part of the brain that governs all of this is the last to be fully developed. Uh, and so it's an important that we know that this is an important part of the brain in regards to teenagers. It's in a second development stage. Next slide, please. Here's inside the teenage brain, and I know those of you who work with teenagers know a lot of this is very true. When we take a look at the prefrontal cortex, that in an adult it's fully developed. In the teens, it's immature, prone to high risk behavior. Other parts of the brain, it loses. They have a tremendous learning curve to go through. I tell a lot of times teachers, particularly in the high school avenue, or particularly driver education teachers, that if you want a student, a young person to develop something with a 2 or 3 year olds, you have to have them go through something over and over and over again. You have to do the same thing with a teenager, because it's something that's very, very important that we do. I'd start doing this a long time ago. I always tell people that if you want somebody to do something well, and particularly a teenager, you need to have them go through it at least 28 times without making a mistake. 28 times it becomes more of a thing of memory. It becomes a natural thing, and we know that this is very important. A couple of people have asked the question, which I will answer right now, is that will I provide a copy of this PowerPoint to anybody? And the answer is yes. And if there's a way of doing it through the Midwest Injury Prevention Alliance, that would be one way, or I can put my email address in the chat box at the end here, and you can write me a note requesting it. I'm more than happy to do so. Either way, it's best for the Midwest Injury Prevention Alliance. Next slide, please. That's a good way too, Laura. You can mail us out to registered attendees. Okay, let's take a look at the brain. We talked a little bit more about this. I've actually talked a lot about this already. So it continues to grow, and if you see the 5-year-olds, you can see the red area is actually more functional area, and as they get into the teenage years, it starts to disappear, and all these studies show that if we're dealing with showing marijuana, it's going to affect the attention, motivation, memory, and learning. And we know too that that even in regards to young people starting the regular use of marijuana, we know that if they start use before age 14, that they're more likely to have serious issue with various forms of other addiction as they get older. And I mentioned earlier that my family practitioner is also an addiction specialist, and he sees a lot of this in his practice. And we do know that adolescents who start marijuana lower can end up having IQ at a lower number of points, let's say. and we find that they also tend to have issues with drop out of schools. So this is an issue that is important. I think the numbers are important, but it's more important to understand what effect marijuana has on the teenage brain and so on. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, this slide talks about the fact that marijuana affects the brain that plays a role in pleasure, memory, cognition, concentration, movement, coordination, sensory perception, and perception of time. To yourself, answer this question. Which of the above are important functions of driving? Or if you want to put an answer in the chat room, you can do that too. I hope every one of you said every one of these. It provides a pleasure too, but yeah, and driving to a lot of people is a pleasure, even though it's a lot more than that. But I understand if you said pleasure wasn't, I understand why that could be not included in there. But I think a lot of us like to drive that car. If I had had that Tesla electric vehicle I've been wanting for a while, if I had one, it would be a pleasure for me to drive that, but not necessarily under the influence of marijuana. Next slide, please. This is an important question here, and this is probably towards the end of my slide presentation. Based upon the data and information presented, and since the implementation of recreational marijuana laws, what do you predict will be the likely income of teenage driving and the use of marijuana in the Midwest? And if you'd like to answer that yourself, please do. If you'd like to answer that in the chat box, please do too. But I think this is something we all need to think about, and particularly, and we know due to the fact of where they get marijuana from, that young people will find ways to get marijuana, initially from friends, initially then from peers, initially from people who sell marijuana, take it from home wherever. Then we know they're going to have access to that, and so we need to be concerned about what is happening and what will happen more so as the use of marijuana changes in use in these different states, and realize too that like any law, like if it's DUI or if it's marijuana, if you drive to another state and you're under the influence, you're under the influence in their state, and not what it is in your own state. So some states have more strict laws than some of the others. For example, like Indiana and Wisconsin in these 6 states. Next slide, please. And I'd like to end this presentation by basically saying that if you feel different, you drive different. And marijuana makes you feel different. Having a teenage brain makes you feel different. And so we find that with teenage drivers, for example, that if they can survive the first 6 months of driving when they get their license, they're probably going to be okay. It's that first 6 months when a lot of teenagers have their crashes, and for what we see now, I ask the question sometimes too that, this past year we've been involved, and we're coming up to the anniversary of when we kind of start shutting things down. I guess last March 13th. Actually, that was the last time I saw my granddaughter in Bloomington, Minnesota. We thought we would have a reduction in motor vehicle crashes in the United States. Guess what? In 2020, we had an increase of somewhere in the neighborhood of 23% motor vehicle crashes in the United States. Our number of fatalities went up for the first time in 4 years. we had the highest increase per fatalities of per 100 million miles driven, which was 24%. It was the highest since 1923. Why is that true? Why is that true? We found, and I'll answer the question, if some of you like to put an answer in the chat, please do. We found there was fewer cars on the road, but guess what people did? They drove faster. The state of Minnesota had tickets. Thank you, Pam. The state of Minnesota had 500 arrests in 2020 for people going over 100 miles per hour on their highways. 500 people. And the other big issues have been related to marijuana and other drugs and so on. And you know, Pam's got the good response there too. They were driving under the influence. Alcohol, marijuana, and legal drugs and illegal drugs. So, next slide, please. Now, one of the things too, you'll notice on all of my slides, I gave sources to where all this data came from, and also after the slide, which you don't need to go to, I've got other references I use for this presentation. So, but are there any questions? Yeah, self-medicating since last March. Yeah, I think some of us would like to do that. But some of us don't do that at all, like myself. But is there any chat questions that people ask that I may try to answer in the next couple of minutes that we have left?
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, please write them in the chat and we will get them asked.
I can try to look too. I appreciate the comments that many of you've made. Let me see if I can see. And I think the comment that Pam forwarded me, and I'm concerned about the prevalence of impacted teen drivers is only going to be increased. And I agree with that. And I think we'll have to, I think we'll have to play with the data. We have to look at the data. I'm a researcher by training, and so I'm going to. That's going to be one of my things that that I'm going to keep on paying attention to. One of the things that wasn't mentioned, I'm actually, besides doing research, I'm in my 56th year of teaching, and I enjoy teaching people about new topics and things that they may even know a lot about. So, and I'm going to put my email address in here. I think it was maybe at the beginning of the presentation, and if you want to write me, you can write me, but I will go to I will go to the Midwest and let them share with you, and they've already got my presentation, so they can share it. So
thank you, Dr. Ritzel. We do have a couple questions that popped up. The first question is, how close do you think we are to a roadside test for marijuana?
I would say it's a few years yet. I know there's some trials and some tests right now, and you know, obviously the best test for it is blood, but until we get into a test that's a lot simpler and easier to use, the blood test is the only one we have right now. I would say it's going to be a few years based upon what I'm seeing right now.
Excellent, thank you. And another question is, how does this change any prevention, education, or outreach to reduce these statistics for parents and teenagers?
Well, that's an interesting question, and not an easy question to ask. I really think it gets down to what we try to do in any type of educational prevention type of environment. We need to teach everybody that's involved with a certain individual. It's not just teaching teenagers. Let's say in the case of teaching them about the effects of marijuana, maybe in in a public health class or a school health class or a driver education class, whatever it may be. But I think it also involves having parents involved, and I think that's an important, parents are guardians, and so it takes a whole group of people to really work on this issue together. And I think we tend sometimes to put the problem on it not going well on teachers or public health people, and we know that's not the case because it takes a lot more than that. But I really think we need to focus upon getting a whole group of people together to do this.
Excellent, thank you. I know we're just over time, so understand if people need to leave. We do have one final question, which is, was marijuana use by parents or guardians considered or researched?
Yeah, I was going to go up to that question again because I saw. I just want to make sure. Well, it's from the standpoint of adults, but I don't think they've matched teenagers to what their parents' involvement has been. Even though I think that's an important study, and I will try to research that a little bit more to see if there's something out there. And I like to, but that's about all I can say about it right now. I like to Denise, who talked about roadside tests. We are working on a prototype measuring retinal response. Yes, I'm familiar with that test, and I know that they've had to stop that because of funding going to everything COVID, which I totally agree with. Yeah, 2 weeks ago today I was vaccinated the second time, so I'm happy. I'll say that. So.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Ritzel, and thank you everyone for joining us. If you want to learn more about MIPA, the Midwest Injury Prevention Alliance, the website is right there. It's midwestinjurypreventionalliance.org. And I hope you all have a great afternoon.